quickly. And I will be monitoring the control panel to see what chat looks like. And if you do have any questions, please send them that way, and we can keep this a little bit informal. That I would be happy to answer questions as we go through the presentation. That said, we're going to launch. There we go. All right. Biomass power, in spite of it having a long history, originating basically the origins of humankind, in its most recent incarnation is a relatively new business. Absent some old wood-fired power plants and the paper industry, what we're talking about with today's incarnation is essentially starting a whole new set of business, and that the business of biomass in this case is basically a fuel switch from fossil hydrocarbons, then primarily coal and natural gas. I'm trying to advance this. There we go. The next series of slides are examples and exhibits on various types of conversion processes. For today's purposes, although the next couple of slides I'll talk about some of these others, what we're really going to focus on is the steam turbine generator for the production of electricity and process and space heat. There are many other types of applications, but for today's purposes, we're going to focus on those platforms. It's not too much of a stretch to see some of the rationale for doing so. The thermal efficiency, when you do a combined heat and power plant, it can be anywhere between 20% to almost a 40% boost. There are the more common CHP systems are boiler-based, though there are emerging turbine-based systems. But in the United States, and particularly in the Wisconsin setting, almost all of our systems are boiler-based. These systems are not rocket science in terms of degree of complexity. As you can see, you've got a fuel source, combustion chamber, flue gas cleaning. Often there's a secondary combustion chamber, boiler, and a turbine. It's a very standard approach to any kind of solid fuel-based electrical generation. The real key is in the thermal recovery of these systems, exhibited by the heat register here. Gasification, as compared to a combustion boiler system, is not only typically more robust in that you can have various types of biomass feedstock and fuels, but it also can be a platform for doing something more than just heat and power grid. There are emerging platforms in gasification. Oops, sorry about that. Back up. Emerging platforms in gasification that are being looked at by increasing numbers of audiences for production of things besides power and process heat. But in particular, pyrolysis and gasification systems for producing chemicals and fuels. One other area of interest in terms of large-scale systems is combining biomass or solid fuels with biogas. These are being investigated primarily by public sector institutions that have large and predictable thermal loads. One of the benefits of combining these two types of fuels, the solid and the biogas, is that the biogas tends to be a consistent fuel type that the boiler likes to see day in and day out, whereas biomass can sometimes have a high degree of variability in the quality of fuel. Someday it may be C and D with very little moisture content, very low ash, and the next day it may be forestry residuals with high contents and high ashes. what a biogas, by blending the two in a boiler system that allows for that flexibility, allows for the biogas to make up for the problems in the solid fuels. And I throw this slide in because this is what happens when you get a bunch of academics and agency people, and you get them in a room. They can create some rather elegant applications. Well, I don't mean to poo-poo this, but in terms of project financing and project development in this space, we're going to start with we're going to cover today a pretty simple platform, combined heat and power. Though, that said, interest in Europe, Asia, and the United States in these system-like thinking, using biomass as the principal feedstock, is beginning to take a little more hold, and there are projects in Brazil and Southeast Asia as well as Europe that have adopted this system, this approach, looking to squeeze the most amount of value out of a technology platform as possible. In Wisconsin, Xcel's Bayfront facility is the longest operating biomass facility in the state. It's a 73 megawatt steam turbine plant. Used to be a coal combustion system, but in the most recent years it's primarily burning biomass. The biomass is secured, purchased from a number of different logging organizations in and around the Ashland area. It purchases north of 233,000 green tons of biomass a year, but that won't necessarily just be forestry residuals, but it'll also be C&D. Xcel has a long history of purchasing in this area, and ironically, all the purchasing is handled out of their Denver office, but is delivered locally. Domtar, on the other hand, and the We Energy facility in Rothchild is the newest large-scale biomass facility in Wisconsin. It is a CHP, thermal offtake, goes for process heat, mostly in the way of steam, to the Domtar paper mill, and then We Energy puts the balance, so what's available after that, on the grid. It began operations in 2013. It's a 50 megawatt cogeneration plant. CapEx was almost $270 million, and it consumes about 500 tons of wood and paper processing residuals a year. Stoneman is a retrofitted plant. It's owned by DTE. It's located in Cassville, Wisconsin, which is on the Mississippi, not too far from Dubuque, just north of Dubuque. It used to be a coal facility. DTE cut out the bottom of the boiler and put in a fluidized bed. It's a 40 megawatt, sells all the power to Dairyland through a PPA, and consumes approximately 300,000 tons of bone-dry tons per year. Now that number will vary because there's a fair amount of railroad ties and C&D fuel, but DTE also contracts with foresters in and around the southwestern Wisconsin region for its biomass fuel. All right, we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about process, about building a business for biomass CHP. And I'm going to throw a lot of information by you, but I wanted to give you an appreciation and an overview of what's all involved in building a business around a power plant. In this power plant of varying sizes, the examples I'll use today will range from as large as 50 down to 15 megawatts. It's a pretty standard process flow. Biomass from harvest goes through fuel processing. If there's an off-site market for the fuel processing, great, goes for the boilers and turbines, electrons to the grid, and there's a thermal exchange. Let's look at this first sector. Biomass fuel and the supply chain is by far and away the aspect of any biomass power project, be it or biomass heat project, that has the most amount of risk. And as such, needs to be almost bulletproof in its development. Every biomass fuel supply will reflect the regional characteristics. It will reflect what's available versus what's potential. And those are two different numbers. What the opportunity costs are for the players, whether there is an opportunity to provide fuel to a facility, where does it go to building, where does it go to mulch, etc. There are the collection, harvest, and storage. Transport is the guts of the supply chain. Environmental and sustainability issues are always of everybody's concern, because if you think of it in these terms, if you are entering into a supply agreement with a facility that's expected to last 10, 20, 30 years, that supply chain has to match the demand presented by the power plant. And so exploiting a biomass shed in the short term, leaving you exposed in the long term, isn't necessarily the best strategy. Transaction and carrying costs for the inventory have to be built into this, as well as the processing specs and the costs to the converter themselves. There are many different functions and roles in the supply chain. The broker, the dealer, or the person who puts the deal together, whether that be in a strictly a buy or as actually a project developer. The producer of the biomass themselves, the harvester, the collector, those who transport, store, and take care of the logistics, who processes the fuel, and is there a business or financial service provider. In some cases, all of these functions can be provided by one or by a group of companies or participants in the supply chain that perform all these functions. In the case of Bayfront, that's pretty common, is that they're securing the stumpage, they're producing the wood, they're collecting it, they're transporting it, they're shipping it, and they're acting as the business agent. Various types of supply structures exist. What is the most common, and the examples that I gave earlier, is a vertical integration. Okay, what that means is that the converter, the power plant, actually owns and finances or operates a large degree of the supply chain. In other cases, it's outsourced, where bids are going out, the bids are solicited, and it's up to the producer, the harvester, the collector to perform the functions in the supply chain. How it's managed, though, is it has historically been internal. That is, the power plant, the operator, receives their supply delivered as is, and then they bear the burden of dealing with the feedstock or the blend of the feedstock internally with their own equipment, with their own personnel. What this system is competing against is from the fossil hydrocarbon, is much more complicated, because with natural gas or coal, you place an order, you expect that feedstock mix to be managed by the vendor or the supplier. The vendor's paid by meeting specific characteristics of feedstock, whether it be Powder River Basin coal or whether it be natural gas, but it's expected that there be a consistent quality. We're not seeing that approach in the biomass space quite yet. There will be inroads as densification facilities play a larger role in feeding conversion platforms, where you can expect consistency. You can envision companies like Mark Wood Products and Indec and others to start fulfilling that role and then gaining the confidence of the converters that they're capable of doing so. Let's look at this a little bit better, because it's important to understand, if you are in the supply chain, if you're the supplier, how the converter thinks. In this case, when it's internally managed, the converter staff and systems are managing the fuel. This requires the converter to maintain lots of staff. For instance, in DTE's case, they were brokering over 1 billion tons of coal a year to various power plants, and that entire system was managed by 2 people. In their biomass supply, they've got, I believe, 5 plants, maybe 4 plants, and they were dealing with less than 1 million tons a year of biomass supply, but yet they had 6 people internally dealing with that. It requires a commitment by the converter. If that commitment, if that trust can be extended outside, then the vendor is required to provide the staff and systems, but they're closer to the fuel itself and perhaps are better suited to do so. They define fuel equipment, everything is contracted outside of the firm. And then the converter staff, that is the power plant, are responsible primarily for managing the relationship with the biomass supplier. This is more in line with the coal situation. This is the ideal, so to speak, for biomass suppliers, but we're not quite there yet. I do see the pendulum starting to shift eventually. And in those cases, you're going to start to see mixed, where there'll be a certain amount that will still be dealt with by the converter, and then they'll start identifying players in their supply chain who they deem creditworthy and provide them more of an opportunity to provide turnkey services. All right, so let's go back to the basics of this supply chain. There's a land base, the producers, harvesters are involved, landing and shipping areas, on-site shipping and drying, gasification, transportation, and finally makes it to the market. There are in some circumstances, and we've seen this especially in Scandinavia, where there are multiple functions, such as on the bottom. There's the initial conversion to the power plant, biomass, biomaterial production, and shipping and screening, gasification. This is more of the biorefinery process, whereas primarily what we're seeing in the United States yet is the raw material comes in, it's chipped, screened, shipped. This slide provides an example of a fuel matrix. As you'll see that in this case, the supply chain was considering 5 different sources, actually 6 sources of raw material: switchgrass, corn stover, green wood chip, dry wood chip, densified, etc. What they ended up settling on was a mixture of switchgrass, corn stover, and green wood chips. By factoring in the various components into the cost of the materials, in this project, these are live numbers from a live project. This was the estimate of what the delivered price for the per BTU was going to be. This type of analysis, as granular as you see here, and probably even more so because there's a lot involved in each of these numbers, is pretty much a bare bones minimum requirement for developing any kind of cost estimate. Let's move into capital costs and conversion facility. The conversion technology is dependent upon the offtake. That is, the market drives the development of the project. You have to take a look at the needs of the customer, who the offtaker is going to be. If you are operating a CHP, you're looking at basically 2 different types of offtakes: power and thermal. There are differences in capital costs between conventional boilers versus gasifiers, whether it's a dedicated or a coal-fired facility is a dedicated to 100% biomass, or will this biomass be burned with coal? Key drivers are cap costs per the installed capacity and capital cost for the hot water or the steam capacity. What are the site or infrastructure costs? Fuel handling and processing costs, staffing and maintenance. General rule of thumb on the fuel handling is the more robust, the more diverse your feedstock, the higher the capital cost for fuel handling. And there may also be higher capital costs for the boiler system itself. For densified, this is a compact boiler, okay? Fairly simple system, top feed, combustion chamber, rock and roll. Hearst is a vendor of these types of systems. I just pulled it because it was available in the public domain, but there are numerous types of vendors for these smaller boiler systems. What impacts capital costs? The availability of credit enhancements, loan guarantees in particular, dramatically impact capital costs for projects. If your state, your region, your country offers credit enhancements in terms of the loan guarantees, it is almost imperative, given that we're competing with fairly low fossil fuel prices, that these be integrated into the funding of your project. Same holds true with tax credits. Up until 2000, I believe it was the end of 2010 was when the 30% expired, but back then 1603, the IRS rule 1603 was probably the biggest jump starter, steroid this industry has ever seen. What is the debt and equity underwriting criteria? What's the creditworthiness behind the project sponsor? Will also influence capital costs, because the creditworthiness of the sponsor and the viability of the project, financial viability of the project, will to a large degree determine what senior debt financing will look like in terms of the tenor and the rates. The next topic is often one that doesn't receive, and at least in my opinion, enough attention by potential project developers in the earliest possible. There's a general rule of thumb in project finance is you never fall in love with the technology unless that technology has a bulletproof performance guarantee backed up by a strong balance sheet. If the technology is experimental with a new vendor, it's not likely to have a strong or any performance guarantee as compared to a boiler system that may have been operated for the last 20 years and has a sound company behind that. To a certain degree, choosing your engineering, consulting engineering, in this case the EPC contractor, that's an engineering procurement construction contractor, can go a long way in determining both capital costs and the overall project feasibility of of a biomass power system, in that the EPC may opt to recommend a little more risky but more advanced technology and play a role in providing a performance guarantee to the sponsor that satisfies senior debt. The last item here is the parasitic load, is how much of the power and thermal energy produced by a project is used by the project itself versus what can be sold through an off-take. The CHP conversion facilities, really what is pretty much known as the heat rate. Okay, but before that is what type of, when looking at conversion of facilities, I made a reference earlier about fuel handling. A simple wood biomass boiler system will probably have the lowest CapEx per kilowatt equivalent installed. That may be a stoker system, it may be a spreader stoker, a fixed rate, vibrating rate type of system. Very simple technology, lots of reference projects out there. But it's going to require that you feed that project with a green wood chip or a dried wood chip, 3 inches plus or minus a half an inch, day in and day out. It's not going to give you flexibility of using different types of feedstock at different types of year or at different, because it's convenient or available. The more robustness you have in your system, the higher the costs. The same with the conversion rate. Okay, if you have high quality fuel one day, low quality fuel another day, the heat rate or the conversion of fuel BTUs to usable power, usable steam will vary tremendously. What's the efficiency of the end user systems, especially in thermal recovery? Okay. For instance, if a biomass boiler project is being sited in an industrial park, and let's say a portion of it is then being piped over to a local community college, how well that the makeup system, the thermal heat recovery system, works, how well it's being utilized in that community college will have a direct influence of how much fuel you need to reheat the water for power and steam. If there's a lot lost there, you have to compensate that in your plans. Hey, is there a thermal offtake for fuel processing? Are you using a portion of your thermal offtake, whether it be gas, like flue gas, or a water jacket system to actually dry the fuel before it's being combusted? Is that built in, and is there a rationale for building that in? Are there incentives or disincentives for coal combustion? Do you want to have natural gas brought into a boiler system, especially if it's available, that allows you to have a more robust feedstock system where you can use higher moisture content fuels? And emissions and controls. This is an evolving topic. We're not going to spend much time on it today, but the EPA's Clean Power Plan and how biomass fuel and conversion systems are going to be treated, that has a huge impact on the overall capital costs of any project. So let's spend a little time on looking at the revenue. In the finance world, we call this the top line analysis. It's the top line on your income statement. An offtake agreement will have an amount and a price, and lots of other language, but those are basically is what volume or how much stuff are you providing and at what price. The price, in some cases, is a published tariff. It's a buyback rate by a local utility, a buyback rate by a government, and it's known to all bidders, and you have to compete for that buyback rate. In many cases, it's negotiated. Since Wisconsin is a regulated environment, we're almost always negotiating that with the utility. In some cases, the utility may have marketed or pre-sold the capacity of your project, and those negotiations were with the end user. Is this a base load project? In most cases, it will be, and as a result, you should be expecting a capacity payment for that base load, which means that you're getting a fixed payment each and every month that you have this boiler system, these turbines, and this power available for the grid. Other characteristics of the power purchase agreement will be the length of terms of the tenor, what happens if you don't perform, and if well done, are fuel risks addressed. One of the cases I'll talk about at the end of the presentation this afternoon was a rather innovative way of how future fuel risks were built into the power purchase agreement. Other things to consider: are you dovetailing on an existing PPA, or is this a brand new contract? We worked with a municipality a while back that had an agreement in its power purchase agreement from its wholesale supplier that it could, as a municipal utility, put up to 20 megawatts of power back onto a grid, which meant that they were looking at building a biomass project to replace their current diesel generators, because when they looked at the numbers, it made more sense to do that because of fuel costs. The only hiccup that this project ended up facing was that the anchor tenant for the thermal offtake kind of went away. Can there be credit support provided? Either that can, in this case, I'll use the example of the municipality. The municipality could actually float its own bond, and it was part of a joint action agency. and could enhance its ability to reduce its senior debt, the debt necessary for the project, by using bonding. Does this qualify for rate case, where do you have the cooperation of the regulated utility to build this in, and as a seller of wholesale power to utility, are they collaborating with you and then going to the Public Service Commission or Public Utility Commission to present the rate case to support the project? Are there environmental attributes? In this case, in cases of power, they're typically renewable energy credits. There's not much of a carbon offset market right now. Are there production tax credits that can be built into the equation? Can those be pre-sold? Who's the operating entity? And will there be various ownership options? Not all power projects start and end with the same owner. Outside of simply selling power, in many cases, a biomass facility will represent power savings. This is especially true for large-scale systems in industrial settings. They're not quite utility scale in the sense that they're being primarily developed to provide baseload power to support the grid, but they're supplementing or replacing power bought off the grid internally to self-supply, and that the revenue represented by the electrical production is behind the meter, or net meter. This does typically require the cooperation of the utility provider. They still are the backup provider, but because it's behind the meter, it tends to provide the highest value project, highest value revenue, so to speak, because you're offsetting retail. Thermal. As compared to electricity, thermal does have some flexibility in actually what is the product you're selling. Are you selling steam at various pressures? Or are you selling hot water to a user and allowing them to do the delta T, take it up to or down to the temperature that they need? Or are you selling both? Pricing, again, can be negotiated, or it can be metered as avoided costs. It can also be sold as a fixed rate or an indexed rate. There's a certain point in a relationship, just like with power, when it reaches the substation, when you're selling to a utility, or behind the meter, if it's internally, the ownership of that power changes or doesn't change. And in the case of thermal, that also has to be carefully monitored. It has to be metered at some point in time, on some point in its life, of the steam or the hot water, where it stops being the generator's steam and ends up being the customer's steam. That is typically at the metered level. Recovery and makeup support. These are nuances, but they're important contractual nuances. If, for instance, the example I used earlier in the community college, if for some reason they were having problems in their recovery system, or one of their boilers was down, and you as the operator of the CHP are facing a situation where the makeup water you're receiving back from the college is either warmer or cooler than what you had anticipated to optimize your system. Well, transactionally, you might be able to support that, but if it's a longer period of time, the contract should be addressing what happens when systems aren't operating as designed. Who's responsible for the infrastructure? Up to the metered point, or are you as the developer responsible for the entire makeup system, recovery system, or is it, as with point of ownership of the steam, does it begin and end someplace else? Who's responsible for the whole system capacity and the performance? Is this you being contracted to provide steam, or are you just being contracted to provide hot water? Or are you being contracted to provide both and being compensated for both. And then who's responsible for the backup systems? In most cases, 90%, 95%, the backup systems will be with the off-taker. For instance, the community college can maintain their systems as much for just general downtime on the biomass boiler, scheduled maintenance, as well as for unscheduled downtime. Again, as with power, smaller scale, it's cost savings. And in most cases, with thermal offtakes, you are providing up to 100%, not quite. Especially in a northern environment like this, and when you have multiple off-takers, or you have an off-taker whose process, such as a paper making or food processing, is highly variable, or that the owner of the facility is not willing to transfer this responsibility to process heat back to you as the CHP operator. In this cases, they're going to take steam or hot water at a certain grade and then up the pressure, down the pressure, up the heat, down the heat to meet their specific terms. And let's spend some time on riskiness. Every project, especially projects of magnitude, have certain risks. In biomass power systems, there's technology, there's operational, there's supply risk, as we talked about earlier, there's market risk that the buyer may go away, there's price or competitive risk, and contractual risk. Let's peel these onions back a bit. I'm sorry, pardon me. In addition to that, ownership structure, policy risks, regulatory risks, funding risks, and have you picked the right business model? The example that's on the screen is drawn from a large-scale biopower utility scale. Every boiler is rated at a certain capacity, and most public utility commissions, public service commissions, will issue licensing at a certain capacity. Most vendors of boilers will support or provide performance guarantees at a certain capacity. If there is a fuel switch from coal to biomass, understanding whether or not that boiler will be derated because of the variable quality or the changing quality of the fuels is really an important issue. As is the internal employee risks, or the ability you're moving from a feedstock in that there's a predictable long-term price that you can get from Wyoming or from Southern Illinois, and now you're going to local markets. That presents a certain degree of price and supply risk that you don't have in fossil fuels. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on. External risks. Lack of infrastructure guaranteeing delivery. Lack of infrastructure for long-term production risks. For instance, what happens if a tornado or a series of tornadoes go through a region and knock down all 20%, 30% of the trees. Capital costs, quality control issues, competition for biomass, such as a resurgence of a housing industry, and what happens to the price of biomass. And lastly, the regulatory or the environmental oversight. There's been a lot of progress on how biomass is treated as a renewable fuel, especially over the last couple of years. EPA is starting to come up with what appears to be a firm set of long-standing, that can hopefully be long-standing, set of rules, and we're not quite there yet. Contractual issues involved in this supply or this value proposition. Biomass supply, as for instance in the Bayfront example, the value proposition to the loggers that Bayfront presented was it gave them a second or third market Okay, the previous two markets were pulp and building materials. It gave them an additional market for utilization of their logging operations and of available lands. The value proposition for them was that as long as they showed up on a regular schedule with a predictable amount, they had a very credit-worthy off-taker who would pay them on a regular schedule for what they delivered. The burden upon them was to address the metrics. Does it make sense for me to bring my residuals or my forest crops in? Should I go out and find C and D, etc.? Have I thought this thing through? The reality is, and in the Bayfront case was a very good case study in this, is that sometimes, majority of the times, the biomass suppliers made money. In other times, they didn't, but they maintained a relationship and continued delivering product in a short time frame, just so that they could keep the contracts and the relationships with Xcel. Contracting risk. This is probably one of the biggest concerns in the biomass space. Is we're competing against natural gas, we can get long-term contracts. We're competing against coal, we get long-term contracts. Or we can buy wind power, or we can buy solar power, and we can get fixed prices for 20 years. If we're going to go the biomass right, we got to understand what we're doing, what we're dealing with. We have to understand who we're competing with, and then set up a system of pricing that makes sense. In some cases, it's a certain price point that we begin at. It may be $35 per bone-dry ton for the next 6 months. But as the biomass supply and the converter gain trust and the relationship goes on, then we tend to look at indexing. And indexing both against fossil fuels and indexing against other price points such as pulp or building materials. Environmental benefit sharing is not so much an issue now. It was a more important issue in recent past, and it may be more important in the future. What does that mean? It means that if I, as the converter, I own the power plant, if I am getting a production tax credit because I'm using biomass, or if I'm getting a renewable energy credit because I'm using biomass, or let's say in the future there's a carbon tax or a carbon offset credit, the biomass supply industry has become relatively sophisticated, and they expect some sharing. The more astute off-takers, converters, are building this in to their contracts. It doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of dollars and cents at this time, but the fact that they're saying back to their supply chain, as we as converters receive benefits, environmental attributes for going green, we will share them. Long-term partnering versus bid and deliver. Let me talk about the Bayfront. In the Bayfront case, there's a couple different suppliers that are now viewed as partners. They get basically open-ended purchase orders for extended periods of time, where there are others in the service area that haven't been given this partnership status, and they basically get paid on a per delivery price. There's no guarantees, but as long as they continue to deliver a certain degree of quality, they get paid. What they're not getting is involved in the planning process of the offtake. Who maintains the inventory cost risk? Especially in forest products, in forest biomass, wood biomass. This is an issue because the forest products industry and the energy industry tend to have different versions of the future. The forest products industry, a 2-year timber option is a long-term, and that's an inventory cost risk. But if you're the converter, you're facing 20-year PPAs, 10-year PPAs, and banks that want supply agreements that match the term of the offtake. It's an issue. Okay, I'm going to skip through. We've got 10 minutes left here. This is basically a summary of the discussion up to this point. I want to go and spend the balance of the time here examining a case study and talking about project finance. Case study I have the benefit of working with since 2011. Was on behalf of Procter & Gamble. It's in and around a paper mill that they own in Albany, Georgia. P&G had set up a rather ambitious internal renewable energy target of 30% by 2020. In the Albany situation, they had existing biomass. They were already buying pulpwood. It's a kraft mill, and we're purchasing biomass for an existing boiler. They had a standard internal hurdle rate, okay, of X%. This percent was a capital budget hurdle rate that applied to all capital projects, regardless whether it was a renewable energy investment or a process improvement or a marketing campaign. It's one standard rate that has to be met. If it's not met internally, the project doesn't happen. That's an important hurdle because you'll see how it evolved in just a second. There was a military base, a Marine Corps base, about 10 miles away, and that had an appetite for green power. Again, though, just like P&G, the Marine Corps had a set of conditions and standards, and one of those was that they weren't expecting to pay a premium for renewable energy, at least in the beginning term of the contract. Georgia Power is the incumbent utility in the region, and any transactions, because they basically control the state of Georgia in the distribution of power, had any agreements had to get their approval, and yet they, operating in Georgia, were not facing a renewable portfolio standard, so there was no mandate in Georgia to do this. This is what happened. P&G spent a lot of time and energy and resources identifying key players, doing internal modeling, engineering, working with the Marine Corps, and then began the search for development partners. What they ended up recruiting was a company called Sterling Energy Assets. Sterling was a division of a company that had spent made a fairly good business in selling renewable energy credits throughout the nation, but this was their first real endeavor as being a project developer. Albany Green Energy was formed. Sterling was the catalyst, and Constellation, the Maryland-based utility, eventually came in to buy the project and was the owner of record. It's a 40-megawatt operation where the steam contract, the thermal offtake, via a tolling agreement goes to Procter & Gamble and the Marine Corps base, and the power PPA goes to Georgia Power. Behind this is a rather innovative way of approaching things, in that it was financed to a large part by a guarantee by the Albany Payroll Development Authority. This is an authority that was created through a new market tax credit program and in collaboration with the federal government, and took advantage of the substantial payroll of the financial government and state and local governments in and around the area to act as essentially a development bank. And they are the economic entity that operates under the new market tax credit. I don't want to get into the weeds here. Frankly, the more I study it, the less I really know about it. But Procter & Gamble acted as the catalyst for making all of this happen. They really were the sponsor behind this, and they recruited the participants of the other stakeholders. They also de-risked the biomass feedstock supply. They didn't go so far as to guarantee the supply, but they lent significant logistics support, operational support, and planning support. The tolling agreements are 20 years in tenor. The PPA for power is sub 6 cents a kilowatt hour or $60 a megawatt hour. What the real innovation is in this is that the PPA then has escalators. And these escalators are indexed based upon producer price index, an employment cost index in and around the region, the price of diesel, because diesel is a huge component in the cost of collecting the biomass, and a reflection of what's happening in the timber market. And this escalator is applied on a regular review process and then impacts the price of power. Steam sold to Procter & Gamble, who then resells it to the Marine Corps logistics base. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a new market tax credit. Second case study, City of Fennimore. This was the municipal example I talked about earlier. Catalyst behind this was the supplier, a company called Bioenergy Products. They had access to wood dedicated in crop residuals. They entered into a joint development agreement with the City of Fennimore for CHP of 15 megawatts. UMPA, which is the Upper Midwest Municipal Power Association, offered a PPA. The thermal offtake was going to go back, to BEP for a fuel pellet operation, with hot water going to Southwest Tech and hot water going to the industrial park. The processed fuel that was going to be produced by BEP was to be sold to University of Wisconsin-Platteville, Alliant Energy's Nelson Dewey plant, DTE in the region, and Xcel came in. What happened here was a little event in Japan called Fukushima, because the primary occupant for the thermal offtake was a Japanese developed greenhouse, and when Fukushima happened, the capital budget for the Fennimore project disappeared and went back to Japan for rebuilding. All right, we're going to wrap up by looking at basic structure of project finance. Projects of this scale, even the small scale projects such as Fennimore, are still going to have price tags in the $60 to $70 million range when you factor everything in. When you look at a project like the Procter & Gamble one, we're probably talking $170 million projects. These are big projects. And as a result, many of them adopt a project financing structure where the project company is a special purpose entity. It's created just for the project. There are various players here. The feedstock supplier provides the feedstock for the biomass fuel. EPC contractor designs it. The O&M contractor may be the utility, it may be a professional organization, it may be the municipal utility. The municipal sponsor provides the site lease and then guarantees the offtake. This is called a joint use agreement for what's happening on the municipal environment. This is the example I'm giving here is where there's a public-private partnership. And then there's the utility or the industrial zone, commercial zone off-takers. As you can see, there's a whole series of moving parts here. Absent the moving parts, it tends not to happen, especially with a municipal sponsored project, because a lot of the incentives for these things are tax credits, and there's no way to monetize them unless you involve the private sector. In this case, this is where a project, sorry about this slide, but that's steam and power and feedstock. Where the municipal partner provides the site lease, purchases the steam or the power, provides the feedstock, say from urban forestry, from C&D, etc. The lenders come in with non-recourse debt to the project company. That means that the project goes belly up. The lenders are on the hook for that. That there's a third-party developer that brings in equity, but there's also tax investors in this. The reason for that is because of the tax incentives. When this type of model is adopted, The private company is financed, the municipality guarantees the offtakes, and a third party comes in to operate the facility. Once this depreciation, which is typically the 7 to 10 year period, once depreciation has been captured, this private company, the ones that came in for the tax equity, could sell the project back to the municipality. The municipality can run the project and can operate. And with that, and I think I've got 2 minutes to spare on the time, is the webinar for today.
So do we have any questions? I'm going to unmute everybody, and you can talk your questions or you can type them in. Anybody have any questions? Well, I want to thank you, Tim, for doing that. I'm not seeing any questions yet. Well, thanks. AB says thanks, but not seeing any technical questions. So